All right. Looks like we are live. Doo, doo, doo. Oh, all right. All right. Let's see. Mhm. Doo, doo, doo. Welcome, Jams Jars. Hope you're doing all right. Let's see. Everything is contingent. If not, this is us. Well, so at this point in time, the conversation is less of like the God of Christianity or the Hindu God or anything like that. Just more of it is rational to believe that there is an ultimate grounding to all of reality. Um, as far as like which religion has the right information on that God, that's a different question altogether. So at this point in time, the conversation is less on pitting a God over another. It's just, hey, having there be a God and believing that there is this ultimate grounding to all of reality, that's a rational position to hold. Welcome, Guillermo. Family time's important, Zach. Let's see. All right, so if not everything is independent, then welcome deconstruction. Well, thank you for the support, Jay Whitty. Let's see. Everything requires explanation that includes sum total of all things. P6. If the sum total of all things requires an explanation that makes the sum total dependent. So this, so Jams, this is less on specifically whether this particular god is Yahweh or Zeus or anything like that. Uh, there's particular ways to get to the question of a particular religion, but before we even get to the question of religion, we need to have an answer to the question of, is there a grounding to all of reality? And that's what I mean here by God. It's just there is an ultimate grounding to all of reality. And to believe that there is an ultimate grounding to all of reality is a rational position to hold. No, not doing the names wrong, semantics. The God is a title, and I'm simply acknowledging that, hey, it could be the case that the Abrahamic religions got it wrong. It could be the case that the Hindus got it right. Like, all I'm saying at this point in time is before we even get to the question of religion, the idea of a God being irrational is not a position I hold to. Like I said, Jams, like this isn't about the Yahweh question. I also don't believe that there was a global flood. I don't believe that there were kangaroos on the ark. I believe it was a local flood, as well as a story to reveal the need of baptism later on, but it wasn't a literal global flood. So that's not a position that I hold. Um, so unless you're here to actually talk about the God question of the ultimate grounding of all reality, I mean, you're kind of missing the point of the conversation. Because like I said, I don't think that the flood was a global event. I don't even think that there were kangaroos on the ark itself. Um, I also know that there were lots of global flood stories. There was, I think, a flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I know the ancient Greeks had a flood story. Um, and I think there was even some Native Americans who had a flood story. So I know it's a very common mythological story. Yeah, so I've been working on this for quite some time. And I'm trying to get it a little bit more rigid and structured. This is kind of inspired by one of Aquinas's works titled On Being in Essence. You won't find it in the Five Ways, as well as some conversations I've had with other people here on TikTok, namely allegedly Ian. But P1, time is the measurement of change. If nothing existed, there would be no change to measure. Therefore, the conclusion is that if nothing existed, time would not exist. And P3, to move from non-existence to existence is change. The conclusion too is if nothing existed, nothing would ever exist. P4, we observe things existing, therefore there was never nothing. If there was never nothing, there always had to be something. From the third conclusion, because there was never nothing, therefore there was always something. Actually, I've been having a lot of conversations with Ian Kepler. Ian really knows the philosophy very well, and I understand that like if you go in and basically, if you engage with him with attitude, they'll respond in kind. But every conversation I've had with Ian has been very cordial, very gracious, really knows his stuff and helps encourage me to dive deeper into my own faith and my own understanding. But anyway, so the first part of the argument concludes that there always had to be something. And then before moving too further along, some clarifying definitions. When I say being, I mean something that exists. When I say dependent, I mean contingent in the sense that it requires something external for it to exist. Ian's usually not one to kick people. And the Model ontological argument, honestly, like I dislike all ontological arguments. Thomas Aquinas basically points out that all ontological arguments are effectively question begging because they are assuming that we can know the nature of God, but we're trying to argue to the nature of God because the nature of God is existence. And he points out that all ontological arguments assume the nature of God is self-evident, but God is only self-evident to himself, not to us. And if you're trying to argue for, realism, that's going to be a hard thing. They might agree with you on moderate realism, but strict realism is going to be tricky. Thanks, Connie. Hope you're having a great day so far. But yeah, honestly, I think the ontological arguments are great in the sense that they are basically beautiful works of art, effectively, but you're not going to be very convincing. There was someone, I'm forgetting his name, but he described the ontological arguments as sound but unsatisfying. But anyways, when I say being, something that exists, dependent, contingent, or requires something external for it to exist. Independent means that it is necessary or does not require something external for it to exist. So the second part of the argument that I'm currently working through, so this one's not yet done, there was always something. It was either dependent or independent. The trilemma or three options is that either everything is dependent, everything is independent, or there's a mixture of dependent or independent. And just to let you know, Kepler, if you were to present the fine-tuning argument to Ian, they would give you a lot more grace on the fine-tuning than I think most people would, because out of all of the arguments that they've been presented, they feel like the fine-tuning is the most likely to succeed. I disagree, but a lot of people seem to think that the fine-tuning is stronger than I'm giving it credit for. I think the fine-tuning can show you that it's reasonable to hold that the God conclusion, but it won't definitively prove the God conclusion. But Ian seems to think that if any argument will show that a God exists, that's the one that will show that God exists. So either everything is dependent, everything is independent, or there is a mixture. We observe some dependent beings, therefore not everything is independent. And then this is where I was at as of this morning. If everything is dependent, then everything requires an explanation. If everything requires an explanation, that includes the sum total of all things. If the sum total of all things requires an explanation, that makes the sum total dependent. If the sum total is dependent, it requires explanation. P7, 8. If the sum total requires explanation, then that explanation is also dependent. This leads to a vicious infinite regress. All right. Therefore, not everything is dependent. This leaves us with requiring at least one, possibly more, independent beings. Okay, I think I like that. All right, so then we would need to explore what enables a thing to be independent. Because ah, hey, Lacovos. But yeah, not. I think this is solid. I'm not seeing any major errors. I know that people are going to push me on infinite regress, but usually when they're pushing on infinite regress, they're talking about an infinite eternal pass. Sup, nobody on fire? Um, but usually when they're pushing back on infinite regress, they're referring to what's called a vicious infinite regress. Or I'm sorry, when they're talking about an infinite regress being possible, they're talking about an infinite eternal pass, which is not a problem for the argument that I'm talking about. And isn't the type of regress being talked about here. And so for those of you that oh yeah, I agree 100% blind. I've actually got a little video as far as like how Catholics should respond to the current tension between the US government and the Vatican. Effectively, we're called to be Catholics first, and it's only by being a faithful Catholic that one can be a good American, because if Catholicism is true, then we ought to want our country to be a holy nation, and part of it is submitting itself to God. Not, and it doesn't necessarily have to be subject civilly to the Vatican, but at least oriented towards God. And yeah, right now it feels like there's people trying to pick sides between the Vatican and the government, and Scripture shows what people ought to pick if they want to be following Christ. Um, I'm not sure what you mean by secularism, Ninja Dog. Um, but to get back to the infinite regress aspect of things, yeah, like the infinite regress is less of a problem as far as the infinite eternal past. Like even Thomas Aquinas made sure that his arguments could work with an infinite past or not. Um, and I like that approach because basically it's saying, hey, look, regardless of what you believe, whether the universe had a beginning or not, like if it had a beginning, it absolutely does require some type of external cause. But even if it doesn't have a beginning, it still requires a God. Um, and I like that approach, and so I'm trying to incorporate that. So when I say infinite regress, I am not talking about an infinite eternal past. Um, it's more of like the question of do you need to know that you have knowledge in order for it to be knowledge? Well, then do you need to know that you have knowledge, and so on infinitely? I think a good example of it is often called the homunculus fallacy. And that's the type of regress that I'm describing here, not an infinite series of causation, um, because dependency is not the same as causation. Um, a triangle requires and is dependent on its three sides in order for its angles to equal 180 degrees. And so, um, in classical terminology, that was called a cause. But nowadays, when we're talking about causes, we're talking about actions. We're talking about what Aquinas and Aristotle would call the efficient cause, where you have an agent or someone with the ability to act, um, acting on another thing to bring about the effect. But okay, I think where I've got this so far is good. Oh, um, I would say that if laws are good laws and true, and faith is true, then regardless if the laws are based on faith or not, then they're going to be good and true laws that are corresponding to faith. Um, so the way that I view it is the church has a particular role in human society, and the state has a separate role. Um, but it's not where they are in opposition to one another. They are working together or ought to be working together in harmony with one another. Someone had asked yesterday about my view on abortion and the laws for abortion. Um, my view on it is just outright banning it, I think is going to cause more harm than good. I think what needs to happen before we even start talking about any laws regarding abortion or anything like that is we have to um, change the hearts of the people first to where they want the law, where it's not viewed as oppressive. Like we don't view laws against murder as being oppressive. We view it as a way to guide us on what to do when someone violates human rights. Um, and until something like that happens with abortion, I'm not sure if banning abortion like that is going to be a good thing. Um, I view what would end up happening would be something similar to like the prohibition. Um, is it rational to take supernatural claims as fact? I think it's irrational to take any claim as fact until there is enough evidence or reason given behind the claim to justify accepting it. So it has not like I can say that, you know, I have a snake. I have a pet snake. That is certainly unusual, but it's not unheard of. So you wouldn't accept it just blindly. You might ask for a picture of the snake. And then someone else might say, well, no, that picture is photoshopped or AI or whatever. And so for that person, the picture itself is not sufficient evidence to justify their belief in the claim. So it has to do with not the claim in and of itself, but the justification given behind the claim. Is free will universal? As in, like, does everyone have free will? Or are you asking, like, if humans and animals have free will? I didn't say that it's rational to think that all supernatural gods exist, Skibidi. I said that any claim, whether it's supernatural or not, requires support for it and requires justification, rationality, and evidence provided in support for it. So some non-supernatural claims have that, and some don't. And so it's rational to believe the ones that do have it, and it's not rational to believe the ones that don't. And it's the same for supernatural. Yeah, so I'm working on formalizing the argument, but what I've got right now, Skibidi, is time is the measurement of change. If nothing existed, there would be no change to measure. If nothing existed, time would not exist. To move from non-existence to existence is a change. If nothing existed, nothing would ever exist. We observe things existing, therefore there was never nothing. If there was never nothing, there always had to be something. From the third conclusion, because there was never nothing, therefore there was always something. Well, Skibidi, that's kind of what the whole point of the argument is that there was never nothing. So if you would wait a moment and be patient for a moment instead of trying to jump ahead, maybe you'll learn something, because the whole point of that first argument is to prove rationally that nothing is impossible, that there always had to be something and there always is something and there always was something. So you and I are actually in agreement right now. If there was always something, it was either dependent or independent. The trilemma, or three options, is that either everything is dependent, everything is independent, or there is a mixture. We observe some dependent things, therefore not everything is independent. If everything is dependent, then everything requires an explanation. If everything requires an explanation, that includes the sum total of all things. If the sum total of all things requires an explanation, that makes the sum total dependent. If the sum total is dependent, it requires explanation. If the sum total requires explanation, then that explanation is also dependent. This leads to a vicious infinite regress, therefore not everything is dependent. This leaves us with requiring at least one, possibly more, independent beings. So you're asking what was before God? An independent being has nothing before it. Therefore, based on what was shown, there has to be at least one independent thing, therefore at least one being that had nothing before it, aka God. No, Skibidi. So I didn't say that that this independent thing came from nothing. This independent thing always was. And Breezy, so the name of this argument, this is one that I'm kind of forming on my own. It's inspired by the argument Thomas Aquinas used in his work on Being in Essence, which is not in the Summa Theologica. And the situation, and so what I'm doing is I'm trying to basically update the language since the metaphysical language has evolved somewhat. and just trying to make it a little bit more intuitive to people who aren't as familiar with scholastic arguments. So there isn't really a name for the argument, um, and uh, but it is a kind of cosmological argument, and it's going to be a combination of, I guess, the argument of contingency and Aquinas's argument on essence. Um, and so, Skibbity, I think you're missing the point. So there is from the argument, we conclude that there is at least one independent being. An independent being is one that is not dependent on anything. Because it's not dependent on anything, it always existed and never didn't exist. Therefore, it didn't come from anything. So, Skibbity, what's the premise that you disagree with? What is the logical fallacy that's been committed? Because if one of the premises is false, or if or if a fallacy is being committed, then the conclusion doesn't follow. But if all the premises are true and there isn't a fallacy, then the conclusion that there is at least one independent thing is true. And no, Skibbity, I am not saying God is something from nothing. I am saying God. Let me ask you this, Skibbity. Did the universe always exist? Because if the universe always existed, then that's the independent being that this argument is concluding. Okay, that's fine. But if the argument or if the universe always existed, that is the independent being that this argument is concluding. If it doesn't have a beginning, then it requires an independent thing. No, I said an independent being. Yeah, so let's see. So time is the measurement of change. If nothing existed, there would be no change to measure. If nothing existed, time would not exist. To move from non-existence to existence is a change. If nothing existed, nothing would ever exist. We observe things existing. Therefore, there was never nothing. If there was never nothing, there always had to be something. From the third conclusion, there was never nothing, therefore there was always something. If there was always something, it was either dependent or independent. The trilemma is either everything is dependent, everything is independent, or there is a mixture. We observe some dependent beings, not everything is independent. Or, I'm sorry, we observe some dependent beings, therefore not everything is independent. If everything is dependent, then everything requires an explanation. If everything requires an explanation, that includes the sum total of all things. If the sum total of all things requires an explanation, that makes the sum total dependent. If the sum total is dependent, it requires explanation. If the sum total requires explanation, then that explanation is also dependent. This leads to a vicious infinite regress. Therefore, not everything is independent. Therefore, this leaves us with requiring at least one, possibly more, independent beings. So the reason why I can know that there was never nothing is because if there was nothing, then that would include time. And if there is no time, then there is no possibility for things to change. And if there is no possibility for things to change, then it can't change from nothing to something. Well, so God is understood to be is a title, technically speaking, and it's getting to an independent and God is understood to be an independent being. So at this point in the argument, we have concluded at least one, maybe more, independent beings. And so the rest of the argument is moving towards other things. And Skibbity, the whole point is there are two types of things that exist: things that come from stuff and things that never came from anything. They always were. So to ask, where did a thing that never came from something come from, is asking what is north of the North Pole. Nope. Not inserting a creator. In order to make that claim, you would need to show where. All you have to do is, instead of making these assertions on things that I haven't done, show me the logical fallacy or show me which premise is false. If you can do that, then I need to work on this argument more. The argument concludes that at this point in time that it's possible for the universe to be that. Like, this argument isn't finished as of yet. I've just concluded the need for at least one independent thing. So it very well could be the universe, as I said earlier, if you were paying attention. At this point in time, I have just stated that there is at least one independent being. I haven't argued towards what that independent being is as of yet. As I said, this is still a work in progress that I've been working on. And I've gotten to this point and I'm still working towards the second half, which is looking at what enables an independent being to be independent. Well, God by definition is an independent being. So the question is less of, therefore, God, it's more of, is there a religion that claims to worship this being that we conclude to? Well, look at the argument, like I was saying, Skibbity, and if the conclusions doesn't follow from, or if there's a fallacy or one of the premises are false, then tell me no, or tell me now where it is. And the way that logical arguments work, Tearaway and Carb, is if the premises are true and there isn't a fallacy, aka it's a valid argument, then the conclusion is true. So it's not reasoning God into existence, it's taking things that we know and coming to new knowledge within it. That's just how logic works. No, I said there was nothing before an independent being. And that's fine, Tearaway. Which premise is false then? And if y'all want, you're able to come on up here. Like, haven't gotten to that yet, Carb, but because right now there's lots of people who would say that there's brute contingencies, and just trying to show that a brute contingent is an independent thing, and just continuing on and exploring from there. I gotta go, let's see, in 1.5 hours. So there was no before that independent being, because that is assuming that this independent being did not exist. That's like asking what's north of the North Pole. As Stephen Hawking points out, it's foolish to ask what is before the Big Bang, because before is a time question. And if there was no time and time started with the Big Bang, then there is no before the Big Bang. Yeah, I'm trying to do these daily, or not daily, during the week, 9 to 11 Central Standard Time. So I've been live for almost 40 minutes, and I'll be off in about an hour 20. But if you want to check me out, I'll sometimes make appearances on Allegedly Ian's show. They usually go live Monday through Saturday at around 2:30. And I've also made appearances on Unapologetic that has Justin from Deconstruction Zone, Dr. Blitz, and Allegedly Ian. I'll make appearances on that from time to time. Um, and I've got stuff on my TikTok as well as my YouTube, same name, Catholic Thinker, where I go into some of these in a little bit more depth. And JM, if God, so if God was proven, there wouldn't be countless lies of people trying to convince he's real. Well, if by that same rationale, if the Earth was proven to be a spheroid, then there wouldn't be countless lives of people trying to convince individuals that it's not flat. Chris, please try not to insult others. Not really a diversion, just more pointing out that the lack of being able to convince another isn't sign of a falsehood or something not being true. Even when Einstein was putting forth his theory of relativity, a lot of people were not convinced. When the Big Bang Theory was first put forth, a lot of people were not convinced. So it's like appealing to others not being convinced isn't evidence against an argument. Um, you know, that's kind of like a bandwagon fallacy or appeal to populace. Um, and yeah, Tearaway, like the whole purpose of this is less trying to convince people that God is real, um, or that one needs to be Catholic, Christian, or any particular denomination. The point of this is, hey, it's not irrational to believe in God. Someone can be rational and someone can come to the conclusion that there is a God through rational reasons, and someone can be rational and not think that God is real. This isn't trying to claim that one side is smarter or over the other, you know, just more pointing out, hey, it's rational to hold that there is God exists. And no, Jake, I'm not claiming that I've got a crazy theory. What I'm doing is I'm taking arguments that have been around and trying to put it in language that people can hopefully understand. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to claim that I'm reinventing the wheel or anything like that. I'm just very familiar with a lot of these arguments. I'm very familiar with how they sound to non-believers and want to help. The infamous Pascal's wager. So depending on who you talk to, Carb, there's going to be a lot of different answers to the question on whether belief and lack of belief is the difference between going to heaven or hell. Within my faith tradition, non-believers are able to go to heaven. Like, that's not the deciding factor. And again, Skibbity, that's missing the whole argument. Like, you're straw manning at this point. I mean, yeah, I can know that there wasn't nothing. Time is the measurement of change. If nothing existed, there would be no change to measure. If nothing existed, time would not exist. To move from non-existence to existence is a change. So if nothing existed, nothing would ever exist. We observe things existing. Therefore, there was never nothing. And if there was never nothing, there always had to be something. Therefore, there was never, because there was never nothing, there was always something. Where's the fallacy, or which premise do you disagree with? I said that that God isn't dependent on anything before him. Well, show me which premise is false, or what fallacy I committed. Because if every premise is true and there is no fallacy, then the argument is sound. That means that the conclusion has to be true. So, out of the premises, which one is false? And if all the premises are true, what's the fallacy? And just to elaborate a little bit, Carb, Paul himself does say that the Gentiles have a law unto themselves, even if they don't have knowledge. Um, and as a Catholic, I'm not bound to sola scriptura. Um, and I do agree that there's multiple different ways of interpreting the text. I don't know if saying it's cherry picking is accurate, but I understand how that can come off. But the to answer your earlier question about like what is the need for salvation, so um, there's a difference between salvation and being a practitioner of religion. Um, According to the scriptures, it does say that Christ died for all to be saved. And since what God desires, God gets, so therefore all are saved. It's up to us whether we accept that salvation or not. And for some people, that's expressed through visibly being a member of the church, and for others, it looks different. Um, we don't know the state of a person's soul. We don't know the state of a person's heart, and we believe that there are individuals who haven't realized that what they're following is actually God. Um, we call that implicit belief, and it's often attributed or compared to the altar to the unknown God that Paul talks about in Acts. Um, and the and like I said, Paul himself does say that there are Gentiles who will be saved even with remaining as a Gentile, as long as they follow the law, for they will be a law unto themselves. So it's not necessarily like that belief is the necessity. Um, it's just a way to visually have assurance. But it's not exclusively the only way. But looks like chat's calmed down a little bit, so we'll continue on with this. All right, so this leaves us requiring at least one, possibly more independent beings. So the next step, I think, is exploring what enables a thing to be independent. And if you continue reading that verse where he says, "No one comes to the Father but by me," he states that he is the way, the truth, and the life. So if you're going after truth, you're actually following Jesus, even if you don't know Jesus as truth. Um, so the um, so in that sense, like if you're following truth and trying to believe as many true things as possible, then you are implicitly following Christ, is the understanding. Possibly more independent things. Enables a thing to be independent. If something is independent, um, it's not dependent on something else to exist. If something is not dependent, well, there are some miracle testimonies. I don't know how much faith I put into it, but there are some miracle testimonies around the Middle Ages of at least two individuals who were amputated that were healed of their amputation. If something is not dependent, then it only requires itself to exist. Let me see. Let's see. There's the miracle of Kalanda, which took place in 1640. Um, there is the Azusa Street Miracle, early 1900s. There's St. Anthony of Padua in the 13th century that says that he healed the amputated foot of a young man. Yeah, let's see. If something is not dependent, then it only requires itself to exist. P3. Is Yep. Yeah, and I don't use miracles to prove to God. You just asked, like, if there is a God, why doesn't he heal amputees? And I was just pointing out that there are reports of amputees being cured. Um, like I said, I don't know how much stock I put into those stories, but they are out there. Well, I think arguments from miracles are fallacious in and of themselves. In fact, I've got a video on it on my profile. Um, the argument goes like this. If God exists, then miracles are possible. Miracles are possible, therefore God exists. Or even X event is miraculous, therefore God exists. This is confirming the consequence, which is a fallacy. Therefore, any argument that starts from saying, hey, this event is a miracle, therefore God exists, is fallacious in my opinion. Before we can even establish if an event like the healing of an amputee or anything like that is by showing first that there is a God. And then and only then can we determine if an event is a miracle or not. Conclusion. It's independent. Always existed. If something is sufficient for itself, its negation leads to a contradiction. P5 to negate do I want to bring compository into this? Might make it easier, but let's see, to negate the existence. Let's see, looks like we got a guest coming up.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
All right.
So
I
just
wondered why
for,
I had asked. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, just for TikTok purposes, are you over the age of 18?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. What's up?
I asked why you find that to be rational.
The argument that I'm working on?
Yeah. Well, you. Yes. Presumably they're one and the same or tied together. Your statement, belief in God, is rational.
Oh, yeah. So the so to kind of summarize and shorten the argument that I'm working on, uh, when we look at things existing, I can recognize that they are divisible, that they are comprised of parts. For example, I've got my eyes, my nose, my hands, my arms, the cells. It's all divisible. And because of that divisibility, um, those parts are ontologically prior. So, like, for example, in order for me to exist, I require matter, I require physicality to exist. In order for physicality to exist, space-time needs to exist, and so on and so forth. And we can keep further dividing that until finally we get to something that is just a simple physical thing and existence. But that simple physical thing is, and the fact that it exists can also be further divided into existence itself. And so ultimately we get to something that cannot be further divided, which is just existence itself. And that further division of existence is what I mean and understand to be God.
The fact that God is what to you when you say it? That things exist?
No, God is existence qua existence. Like, we can separate all things that exist into what they are and existence.
What?
And we can keep further subdividing until we get to a point where we can no longer divide. And once we get to the point that we can no longer divide, we're left with just existence itself. And so God is that existence itself that cannot be further subdivided.
What is existence itself? It seems to be a property of things, divisible things, by the way.
Lots of people would say that existence isn't a property, like Kant himself. But well, that was weird. That's my first Joker laugh. Is my camera frozen for? Yes, it is. Let me. Hang on. Give me just a moment, people. Looks like my camera isn't working. Well, dang. There we go. All right. But yeah, that was weird. Yeah, I think it's so Will to I think let me see. I'm gonna try this. Um but um I think it's a few days and you also might need to do interactions kind of like what you're doing here. But let me get this back up. To negate. Aw, okay. That's a shame. Let's see. negation of something existing is to claim its non-existence. Unless a contradiction is when you claim a thing is not self P8 to contradict for the negation of an independent thing to be a contradiction for the negation of the existence of an independent thing to be a contradiction, that independent thing would need its existence to be what it is. And no, salvation cannot be purchased with money. That is not what the indulgences were. In fact, even before the indulgence scandal that occurred with Martin Luther, the church had already condemned the idea of selling indulgences, or the idea that you could buy your way into salvation. And Martin Luther's 95 Theses were actually done with the approval of his bishop, and many, if not all, of his complaints were valid complaints. And then politics got involved, and that's what led to the Reformation. I am a Catholic. Let's see, 2nd Maccabees 12:38. Judas rallied his, so 2nd Maccabees 12:38. Judas rallied his armies and went to the city of Adullam. As the 7th day was approaching, they purified themselves according to the custom and kept the Sabbath there. Nothing there about purchasing salvation with money. On the following day, since the task had now become urgent, Judas and his companions went to gather up the bodies of the fallen and bury them with their kindred in their ancestral tombs. But under the tunic of each of the dead, they found amulets sacred to the idols of Jamna, Jamnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear, so it was clear to all that this was why these men had fallen. They all therefore praised the ways of the Lord, the just judge, who brings to light the things that are hidden. Turning to supplication, they prayed that the sinful deed might be fully blotted out. The noble Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened because of the sin of those who had fallen. He then took up a collection among all his soldiers amounting to 2,000 silver drachmas, which he sent to Jerusalem to provide an expiatory sacrifice. In doing this, he acted in a very excellent and noble way, inasmuch as he had the resurrection in mind. For if he were not expecting the fallen to rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he did this with a view to the splendid reward that awaits those who had gone to rest in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Thus he made atonement for the deed that they might be absolved from their sin. So no, he was not purchasing for their salvation. What he was doing was they prayed that their sin might be forgiven even after they were gone. And in accordance with their customs and laws of the sacrifice, sent money over to the temple in order that the sacrificial animals must be purchased. to provide the sacrifice. So it wasn't to purchase the salvation, it was to purchase the sacrifice to offer up to represent the repentance and forgiveness of sins. That's not purchasing salvation. Like, unless you want to say that you giving money to your church in order so that way then you can continue going to your church is purchasing your salvation because you get your salvation from the church, or are you going to purchase your Bible so that way then you can read the Bible to pray the prayers that you need as purchasing your salvation, then we've got two different ideas on what it means to purchase salvation. Let's see, for the negation of the negation of the existence of an independent thing to be a contradiction, and that independent thing would need its existence to be what it is. Therefore, not really. That's literally what was going on. Like Jews would go, or the Jewish people would go as part of their custom whenever they committed a sin while they were alive, go and purchase an animal, and it had to be a particular clean animal. And by the time of Jesus, that's what the moneylenders was you would go in to, because you couldn't use the Roman currency, you would go exchange for the proper currency, and then you would use that currency to purchase the animals needed for the sacrifice. The reason for the overturning of the tables wasn't because of the selling or the money exchange, it was because they were overcharging. That was what the complaint was. So if you have people going in and purchasing the animals required for salvation or for the sacrifice, then the sacrifice, if you're claiming that that's purchasing salvation, then that's the same as giving money to the church that you go to. That's the same as you purchasing your Bible. Well, no, they did it in order to offer for the forgiveness of their sins. And in the Jewish culture, to express sorrow and repentance for a sin and to get the forgiveness of your sin, you had to go through the sacrificial system. So again, same thing is you going and you purchasing a Bible. Like, if you're claiming that you need the Bible in order to be saved, and you purchase a Bible, then did you purchase your salvation? I mean, you can see it as a bad apologetic all you want, but that's the logic that you're applying. Let's see, for the negation of the existence of an independent thing, that thing independent. Therefore, the necessary thing has its necessary thing is existence itself. It literally said to purchase the sacrifice. Which he sent to Jerusalem to provide for an expiatory sacrifice. Looks maxing. According to most early interpretations, he was very wasn't anything special to really look at. Like, he would want people to take care of themselves, but he wouldn't do what's called looks maxing. Can there be more than one necessary thing. Previous argument is only existence. P2. If two things share the exact same identity, same properties, and they are not two separate things, they are one and the same. Conclusion, only be one independent thing. Let's see. I think I'm happy with this. All right, let's see. So time is the measurement of change. If nothing existed, there would be no change to measure. If nothing existed, time would not exist. To move from non-existence to existence is a change. If nothing exists, nothing would ever exist. We observe things existing. There was never nothing. If there is never nothing, there always had to be something. Therefore, there was never nothing. Thus, there was always something. If there was always something, it was either dependent or independent. The trilemma is either everything is dependent, everything is independent, or there is a mixture. We observe some dependent beings. Not everything is independent. If everything is dependent, then everything requires an explanation. If everything requires an explanation, that includes the sum total of all things. If the sum total of all things requires an explanation, that makes the sum total dependent. If the sum total is dependent, it requires explanation. If the sum total requires explanation, then that explanation is also dependent. This leads to a vicious infinite regress, therefore not everything is dependent. This leaves us with requiring at least one, possibly more, independent beings. If something is independent, it is not dependent on something else to exist. If something is not dependent, then it only requires itself to exist. If something is sufficient for itself, it must always exist, or its presence leads to itself. This is from the principle of sufficient condition. If something is independent, it always existed. If something is sufficient for itself, its negation leads to a contradiction. The negation of something existing is to claim its non-existence. Contradiction is when you claim a thing is not itself. For the negation of the existence of an independent thing to be a contradiction, that independent thing would need its existence to be what it is. Therefore, the necessary thing is existence itself. The necessary thing, per the previous argument, is only existence. If two things share the exact same properties, then they are not two separate things, they are one and the same. There can only be one independent thing, as to add anything to existence makes it no longer existence itself. By rational, I mean that one can, using the available evidence to them, can arrive to the conclusion that there is a God through a valid argument. Not necessarily that belief in God is true, just that it's valid to, one can arrive at that conclusion and it not be committing any fallacies. So if you were listening to the argument that I just gave, I conclude that there can only be one independent thing. This independent thing that is existence itself is what I understand to be God. So In order to show that it's not rational, you would need to show where one of the premises is false, or you would need to show a fallacy that was committed. I mean, in classical theism, for your question that the conclusion is compatible with atheism, is that God is existence itself. And the argument that there can only be one independent thing, because the previous argument is that the necessary thing is existence itself. So then the next question is, can there be more than one existence itself things? And this argument here concludes that no, there can only be one existence itself. So from there, classical theism holds that this is God. So existence itself is the supernatural deity. That's the point. God is a title to refer to that which is the grounding of all of reality, of all of existence. And existence itself, which is not the collection of all things that exist, that's not what I'm claiming. Existence itself is that which enables other things to exist. And because of that, because existence itself, it leads to there being a God. I haven't gotten to personhood at all yet. I mean, I haven't spoken with Oppie. I don't know how he concludes that there isn't a God, or what he even means by God. But this is what I mean for there to be a God. Well, no, I didn't say classical theism is only that that existence itself exists. I said that classical theism holds that God is existence itself. Let's see. And as far as the hypostatic union, no. So this gets a little bit into what is meant by personhood and its relationship to essences and natures. But the hypostatic union is that Jesus as a person is a composite person because he possesses two distinct natures, where the natures do not interact with or intermingle with each other. Maybe. So either that means I'm a secret atheist or that everyone is actually a secret theist. Pick your poison. But in all seriousness, Joe, the dialogues that I have with a lot of atheists is it turns out that we actually agree a lot more than people think we disagree. A lot of people, like you said, do agree that there has to be an independent thing. Some people stop there and try to say maybe it could be a brute contingent fact, which I don't think is a coherent position to hold. I think that one must hold to there being some kind of necessary thing. And some will stop at just the universe, but the universe is not existence itself. So I think what ends up happening is we end up agreeing that yes, there has to be some kind of thing that doesn't have an external explanation. Some of them are happy just stopping there. I'm not. I like to keep looking and try to figure out what enables it to be existing externally. So God is not omnipotent in the sense that God has a property of omnipotence. The understanding of omnipotence in classical theism is that it is a that actually is very relevant, because if God, yeah, I'm trying to fix that. There we go. But if it's not a predicate, then in one sense we can say that God isn't omnipotent, because what we're really describing is how it appears to us. Let me see. Well, but yeah. So yeah, I've been working on this argument, pseudo nulli. I'm trying to see if I can get it like shorter, but I'm not sure if it's possible to do that. But time is the measurement of change. If nothing existed, there would be no change to measure. If nothing existed, time would not exist. To move from non-existence to existence is a change. If nothing existed, nothing would ever exist. We observe things existing, therefore there was never nothing. If there was never nothing, there always had to be something. And then following from the conclusion 3, there was never nothing, therefore there was always something. And then before moving on, we have being. By that I just mean something that exists. Dependent, something that is contingent or requires something external for it to exist. Independent, necessary or does not require something external for it to exist. If there was always something, it was either dependent or independent. The trilemma is that either everything is dependent, everything is independent, or there is a mixture. We observe some dependent beings, therefore not everything is independent. If everything is dependent, then everything requires an explanation. If everything requires an explanation, that includes the sum total of all things. If the sum total of all things requires an explanation, that makes the sum total dependent. If the sum total is dependent, it requires explanation. If the sum total requires explanation, then that explanation is also dependent. This leads to a vicious infinite regress, therefore not everything is dependent. This leaves us with requiring at least one, possibly more, independent things. If something is independent, it is not dependent on something else to exist. If something is not dependent, then it only requires itself to exist. If something is sufficient for itself, it must always exist, for its presence leads to itself. This is the principle of sufficient condition. If something is independent, it always existed. If something is sufficient for itself, its negation leads to a contradiction. The negation of something existing is to claim its non-existence. A contradiction is when you claim a thing is not itself. For the negation of the existence of an independent thing to be a contradiction, that independent thing would need its existence to be what it is. Therefore, the necessary thing is existence itself. The necessary thing, per the previous argument, is only existence. If two things share the exact same properties and they are not two separate things, they are one and the same, there can only be one independent thing. And so in order for the counter to work, you would need to show that every single argument that leads to the conclusion that belief in God, that someone has a belief or a conclusion in God, that would mean that this argument that I presented is irrational. It would mean that every single argument that leads to God existing is irrational. So if there is even at least one argument that can lead a rational person to conclude that God exists, then the prompt's accurate. So you would need to show that everything that leads one to conclude that God exists is an irrational argument. Lustral, so if I believe the existence of God is an open question, would that make belief in God rational? It depends. The analogy I like to use is the argument about the infinite eternal past. There are theories in the scientific community that lead that there is an infinite eternal past. There's some that say no, that the universe has a finite past and had a temporal beginning. And there's three positions that you can hold, and all three of them are rational depending on how you approach the evidence. So the argument is less of one position is more rational than the other. It's just, hey, just as it's rational to suspend judgment on the God question, and just as it's rational to say that there is absolutely no God, it is also rational to say that there is God. And so I'm sober. I would recommend checking out Allegedly Ian. They do they're a atheist debate creator that I recommend, and I think they understand the philosophical questions very well. But they show why it is impossible or irrational for God to exist in time. But a good summary of it is, especially here, time is the measurement of change. Well, the understanding of God, in my perspective, and a lot of classical and philosophical understandings, is that God is unchanging. And because of that, if this God is unchanging, then there is no time to measure him, because there is no change to measure. Therefore, he can't be within time. And Joe, this is a completely different question as far as like the how this leads to the ancient war deities, so the Abrahamic faith. That's a whole different part of the argument. Exactly, Lestral. This is an argument for God, as opposed to any specific God. So, Cito, this isn't what's going on. If the math teacher said that all 10 equations are wrong, or all 10 equations are right, and you prove one is wrong, then you've accomplished it. My claim is that belief in God is rational, aka there is at least one argument that is rational to conclude that God exists. You are making the claim that all arguments that lead to God are irrational. Yeah, so the part of that is, so I'm sober, something must be eternal. Yes, something is eternal. And then this argument here that I've subtitled "What Enables a Thing to Be Independent" is why I don't think it's the universe. I conclude that in order for something to be independent, aka eternal, it must be existence itself. Well, you've asked, hey, what if I've got something that is against the prompt of belief in God is rational? Well, as I clarified, the argument is, or the claim is, that there is at least one argument that leads to the conclusion that there is a God. And your claim is that no, belief in God is irrational. So you would need to show that all arguments are irrational. Let's see. Hang on, I'm sober. I'm trying to see if I can't get this sent over to you. Looks like I'm going to have to send it over to you after this live, but yes, I'll DM this syllogism over to you. Well, you said you wanted to go against the claim, the prompt. And the prompt is that there is at least one argument that belief in God is rational, and you said you wanted to argue against that prompt. And I was letting you know what that would entail, because you said you didn't want to argue against the argument that I have up. So if you have an argument that shows that all arguments in God are irrational ones, then great. Okay, fine, Sato. If you weren't talking about yourself, that's fine. I was just, you had asked, what if I have an argument that doesn't relate to the argument that you have, but still shows that belief in God is irrational? I was explaining to you that what that would entail. Oh, Lustral, if you're a Platonic atheist, you might enjoy allegedly, Ian. They are Platonists, at least in regards to mathematical objects. I've made some appearances on their channel and their show from time to time, and they know their stuff very well. So if you're not following allegedly Ian already, go ahead. I was just saying that if you disagreed with the belief in God is rational, what that would entail, because it sounded like you wanted to debate it. And I said, if you want to debate it, so again, same thing. What if? Yeah. I've seen a couple of snippets from Joe Schmidt, and very impressive on what he's been able to accomplish for how young he is. But yeah, I think I'm happy with that. So I might need to clean it up a little bit, but I am happy with the way that's come out. Yeah, I haven't seen his approach to the five ways, Lustral. Out of curiosity, does he say that these are done to show non-believers that God exists, or that this is more of Aquinas trying to explain how to understand God? By the way, welcome everyone that's been joining. Appreciate all the likes, gifts, and follows. But yeah, I would say that like the five ways is one of the most misunderstood arguments, especially by theists. A lot of them present um, uh, that what Aquinas was trying to do with the five ways was more of like offer a definition on what to understand God to be to his students who were already believers. It was not meant to prove that there exists a God. But yeah, I just wish there was a way for this syllogism that I currently have to be shorter, because I feel like each step is necessary, but I don't know. I just feels like it's a lot. But I think I'm happy with this. I'll probably run it on Unapologetic this upcoming Sunday. See how it goes. Keep working and tweaking on it. But yeah, if y'all enjoy, how I try to approach things, I've got a YouTube channel. I'm also like also trying to work on a book. I've got a kind of like a summary of going through from the God question all the way to Catholicism and showing why it's rational to be Catholic, starting from, basically the question of why something rather than nothing all the way to Catholicism. And I want to do a book on that. And um, I'm trying to kind of strengthen and go deeper into the different things. Um, I am sorry, Diver. Um, I try. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's my voice or anything like that. But yeah, people say that my voice puts them to sleep. Which I guess if I do long form content, I can rack up the views of like, hey, put this video on to fall asleep. Um, and then Joe to say like, you know, I don't know, like, what do you mean by purpose? Like, if there is a God, it doesn't seem to serve much of a purpose. Like, what is the purpose of Pluto? What is the purpose of, I don't know, what what does it mean to have purpose? Um, but yeah, and that's something, Cito, that I know. I try to work on it. It just, to me, my voice doesn't sound monotone. Um, but I don't know. It's something that I have to work on. Um, but yeah, like it doesn't sound monotone to me, but I know it is. And it's something that I try to work on. But when I'm thinking on other stuff or trying to focus on other things, I stop focusing on being overly like in order for me not to be monotone, I almost have to be overly inflectuous with my voice, and it's something that I have to pay attention to. I I have not tried that. That might be good to try though. Thanks for that. Yeah, most of my storytelling experience has been reading the church readings at mass, and there you can't exactly do voices. But it's funny, the voice that I use here gets praises at mass, but I know it's not a very entertaining approach or style. But mm, it's a lot calmer today than yesterday, other than the weird guy that came up to do the Joker laugh. So weird. Came up, I mentioned Kant, he laughed and ran. Well, I might end a little bit early because I can't think of anything else that I need to add to the argument that I've been working on. Um, and it doesn't look like anyone wants to come up, but we'll give it 3 more minutes. But I hope y'all enjoyed, and I do mean it. Like, if there's something wrong with the argument that I've been working on, like I want to know. Like, Um, yeah, my aunt actually did that with her kids. Oops, looks like we got someone. Let's see. Let's see. All right. How are you doing, Justin?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Just real quick for TikTok purposes, are you over the age of 18?
Yes, sir.
All right. So, yeah, what brings you up?
Yeah, I actually were looking at your premises, and I thought they were interesting. Just wanted to see if you can talk me through the justification for P1. It looked like that was like, I'm not sure if there was like a previous argument to
Yeah,
the premises that I was looking at, but okay.
yeah. So the full, hang on. All right. So the full thing that I have here, time is the measurement of change. If nothing existed, there would be no change to measure.
Mm-hmm.
If nothing, so therefore, if nothing existed, time would not exist. To move from non-existence to existence is a change. So if nothing, including time, existed, nothing would ever exist because there wouldn't be a way to move from non-existence to nothing to something. But we observe things existing, so therefore there was never nothing. If there was never nothing, there always
I
had to
don't
be,
think I have a problem with that.
yeah. So if there was never nothing, there always had to be something. And then it follows from conclusion 3, there was never
Okay.
never nothing, therefore there was always something. And then before we get too further on, the way that I use being, I just mean something that exists. So your car has being. Your car would be a philosophical being. It doesn't entail personhood or agency or anything like that. Dependent, contingent or requires something external for it to exist. Independent, necessary or does not require something external for it to exist. Those are just the definitions and terms as I'm using them. If there was always something, it was either dependent or independent. From this, the trilemma or 3 options is either everything is dependent, everything is independent, or there is a mixture. We observe some dependent beings or dependent things. Therefore, not everything is independent. So we can already rule out that fork of the trilemma. If everything is dependent, then everything requires an explanation. If everything requires an explanation, this includes the sum total of all things. If the sum total of all things requires an explanation, that makes the sum total dependent. If the sum total is dependent, it requires explanation. If the sum total requires explanation, then that explanation is also dependent. This leads to a vicious infinite regress, therefore not everything is dependent. I do want to pause here real quick. By infinite regress, I am not talking about an infinite causal chain, like an infinite path. Like the infinite regress is something here that's being talked about here is something similar to like the homunculus fallacy, or the idea like in order to know or have knowledge, you need to know that you know it. But in order to know that you know it, you need to know that you know that you know it, and so on infinitely, where it becomes a vicious cycle, or it's turtles all the way down type thing. So that's the type of infinite regress that I'm talking about.
And is the argument in at that point is the argument that there would be some sort of contradiction in that infinite regress, therefore not possible, or I want to make sure that I
in
understand
Yeah,
what it is that you're arguing.
yeah. So an infinite regress is not an argument on contradiction. It has to do with lack of explanatory power or um, basically lack of explanation. So if I asked you, um, how do you know that the sky is blue? And you give an answer. And I say, and how do you know that? And you give another answer. And how do you know that? Either you eventually get to a grounding statement that doesn't have a further justification, kind of similar to like axioms in mathematics, or as Gödel's incompleteness theorem points out, that there are statements that we know are true, yet can't prove to be true. So there has to be some kind of grounding step, so to speak, that justifies everything else, but itself does not have justification external to it. So the infinite regress is less of an argument of, hey, here's a contradiction, and more of, hey, we get to a problem if there isn't an explanatory power behind this series. Does that answer the question?
Okay, and it sounds like um, it kind of for the most part. So thank you for that. But I just
Mhm.
want to make sure that I'm clear. We're not. This is not saying that this version of an infinite regress is addressing this, because we were talking about the contingency argument prior, and we're trying to lay out why there must be something independent or non-contingent, and I'm sure it's going to conclude somewhere with, that's going to be the justification or the rationality for the belief in
Mhm.
God. But my question is this sounds like an epistemological contention, not necessarily a contention with whether this can be the cause for some sort of existence. Am I understanding that right? It sounds like you're saying the problem is
Kind
that
of.
we can't know X.
Kind of. It's less of an epistemological one and more of an ontological one. So um, and you are correct that this is a variation of the cosmological argument. However, I'm taking the approach of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas believed that it was impossible to prove one way or the other if the universe had a beginning or not. So when he comprised any of his arguments, they were all designed to work whether the universe had a beginning or not. So an infinite regress is not about the universe having an infinite past. The universe could have an infinite past, yet, and that still be fine. Aquinas would say even if the universe has an infinite past, it still requires an explanatory power for the whole series, even if each individual chain is an explanation for the next chain. Does that help a little bit?
I think I'm failing to see why, right? Like,
Mhm.
no, it helps. Aquinas was a very, very smart individual. But I think if what we're talking about is, do we have a justified true belief, or at least, I mean, your statement here is belief in God is rational. So if we're saying
Mhm.
we have good reasons to believe in God, or it's a rational belief to hold, and it sounds like your argument is, well, because there must be this being with X properties. My question is if Aquinas is stating, well, it could be an infinite past external explanation, or something that
Mhm.
carries explanatory chain outside of just saying it goes back beyond infinitely. My question is why?
Yeah,
Why must there be something if we're talking about whether we have a good reason to believe that something independent or non-contingent?
yeah. So this is exploring if the idea that everything is dependent. And so if everything is dependent, then everything requires an explanation. But the sum total of all things is itself a thing. So from P4 and P5. Therefore, if the argument is that everything is dependent, that includes the sum total of all things. Therefore, if the sum total of all things requires an explanation, that makes the sum total dependent. Now, your argument or your position, which is perfectly valid at this point in time, is that, well, no, the sum total of all things does not require an explanation. That's kind of what this argument is trying to get to. That there requires, because of the vicious infinite regress, there requires at least one, possibly more, independent beings, even if that thing is the sum total of all things. So at this point in the argument, it's just, hey, it could be the case that all things that make up the sum total are dependent, but the sum total is independent. But you can't say that everything is dependent if the sum total is independent. So this is more of just trying to get to the third option, that there are some things that are dependent and some things are independent, even if that independent thing at this point in time in the argument is the sum total. We haven't established what makes a thing be independent yet. As you can see, that's the next part, what enables things to be independent. It's just out of the three options that are available, we're trying to figure out which of them are true. We already know that the independent one, that everything is independent, is false, because we see things that are dependent. So we're exploring if everything is dependent. But if everything is dependent, that would include the set total of all things. But then that means that that requires an explanation.
Sure.
Therefore, that leads to that infinite regress that I was talking about, even if the set is infinite. But that is, that means that the set total of all things doesn't have an explanation, which is the definition of an independent thing. So that means the third option is the true option, where there is some things that are dependent and some things that are independent. And that's all that at this point in the argument that we're getting at, is that there is something, at least one thing that isn't dependent on something else. Does that help clarify?
Perfect. Yeah, no, I think I'm tracking now.
Okay. So then the next question I feel to ask is, what enables a thing to be independent? And this question is what I feel like a lot of people stop at. Like, they just get to, there must be at least one independent thing, therefore God. And that's where you get into, as you were saying, well, why can't it be the universe, etc., things like that. It's because they're not asking this question of what enables a thing to be independent. If something is independent, it is not dependent on something else to exist. If something is not dependent, then it only requires itself to exist. If something is sufficient for itself, it must always exist, for its presence leads to itself. This is the principle of sufficient condition. So if something is independent, it always existed. If something is sufficient for itself, its negation leads to a contradiction. The negation of something existing is to claim its non-existence. And a contradiction is when you claim a thing is not itself. So a contradiction is not the door is open when it's actually closed. That's in conflict with reality. But a contradiction is where you're saying that the door is not a door. For the negation of the existence of an independent thing to be a contradiction, that independent thing would need its existence to be what it is. Because remember, what we are negating for the independent thing is saying it doesn't exist. In order for that to be a contradiction, what's being negated, the existence, has to be its identity in order for that to be a true contradiction. Therefore, the necessary or independent thing is existence itself. And then the next question is, can there be more than one necessary thing? The necessary thing per the previous argument is only existence. If two things share the exact same properties, then they are not two separate things, they are one and the same. And this is the transitive property. A equals B, B equals C, A equals C. If two things share